On November 20th, 2024, a 60-year-old man in a dark suit sat in a Manhattan federal courtroom, a Bible devotional open in his lap. Throughout the proceedings, he was seen reading from it, taking notes in the margins. Behind him, rows of supporters, ministers, charity executives, family friends, closed their eyes and prayed. The man was Sung Kook Bill Hwang, and Judge Alvin Hellerstein was about to send him to prison for 18 years. "The amount of losses caused by your conduct," Hellerstein said, "are larger than any other losses I have dealt with." He paused. "I don't remember a case where I had to deal with billions of dollars." It was an extraordinary statement from a judge who had spent decades on the federal bench. But Hellerstein was grappling with an extraordinary case, one that had wiped more than $100 billion from the stock market in a matter of days, collapsed a century-old Swiss bank, and exposed a regulatory blind spot that allowed a convicted fraudster to quietly become one of the largest holders of American media companies without anyone knowing. The defense had asked for no prison time, home confinement. They cited Hwang's faith, his charity, his devotion to family. Hellerstein called the request ridiculous. But he also seemed genuinely troubled by the man before him, the philanthropist who had given $600 million to Christian ministries around the world, the investor who claimed to manage money according to the Word of God and the power of the Holy Spirit. "Why do good people do bad things?" the judge asked the courtroom. "Here's a man spending a lifetime on charitable works who commits a terrible crime." It wasn't a rhetorical question. Hellerstein seemed to want an answer. He quoted Psalm 82 about God judging among those who administer judgment. He reminded Hwang that while his relationship to God was important, so was his relationship to fellow man. Though the victims in this case were institutions, Hellerstein said, they were also fellow people. The victims included Credit Suisse, which lost $5.5 billion and never recovered, Nomura, nearly $3 billion, Morgan Stanley, UBS, and others. But also retail investors who bought ViacomCBS stock at $85 a share the same week it collapsed to $48. Municipal pension funds, Archegos employees who had been required to invest their bonuses in a deferred compensation plan that evaporated overnight. $500 million, gone. The prosecution had asked for 21 years. They called the case among a rare class that truly could be described as a national calamity. They also reminded the court that this was not Hwang's first offense. In 2012, he had pleaded guilty to wire fraud after his hedge fund, Tiger Asia, was caught trading on inside information about Chinese banks. A recidivist, the prosecutor called him, not a temporary aberration. Hwang rose to speak. He apologized to those who suffered. He did not admit guilt. "I feel really terrible for what happened at Archegos," he said. "I feel deep pain for all Archegos employees, the banks, and people who worked at the banks and suffered." He asked the judge for a sentence that would allow me to serve as much as I can, given the circumstances. Then he added, "I am grateful to God for so many blessings I've had in my life." The defense had submitted 500 pages of character letters, from the heads of Christian ministries, from seminary presidents, from prison chaplains. They described a man whose only hobbies were faith, food, philanthropy, and books. The prosecution pointed out that many of those character witnesses ran organizations that had received Hwang's money. They also noted that after Archegos collapsed, Hwang had hired several top executives at his charitable foundation, executives who might otherwise have testified against him. "People who might testify against him," Hellerstein said, finishing the prosecutor's thought. He also questioned the narrative of Hwang's modest lifestyle. Yes, Hwang drove a Hyundai and claimed to shop at outlet malls, but during the trial, he had rented an apartment at Hudson Yards, one of the most expensive addresses in Manhattan. In the end, Hellerstein gave Hwang 18 years plus 3 years of supervised release. He ordered restitution of $9.4 billion, a number so large it would likely never be collected. Hwang's remaining net worth was $55 million, a fraction of a percent. The son of a Korean pastor who arrived in America at 18, worked the night shift at McDonald's, and built one of the greatest fortunes in Wall Street history, was going to prison. But the question the judge asked, "Why do good people do bad things?" would remain unanswered. To understand Bill Hwang, you have to understand the world he came from. Bill Hwang was born in South Korea in 1964. His father was an evangelical pastor. His mother was a missionary who had worked in Mexico. When Hwang was 18, the family immigrated to Las Vegas. He spoke almost no English. He took a job working night shifts at a McDonald's on the Strip, learning the language while flipping burgers. Within a year, his father was dead, age 50. Hwang and his mother moved to Los Angeles. He enrolled at UCLA, studying economics. He would later say he barely managed to graduate. Then Carnegie Mellon for an MBA, then a job at Hyundai Securities in New York, working as an equity salesman. It was an unremarkable start, but Hwang had a gift for understanding Asian markets at a time when few American investors were paying attention. He moved to Hong Kong, joined a firm called Peregrine Investments, and there he met a man who would change his life, Julian Robertson. Robertson was a legend. His hedge fund, Tiger Management, had been one of the most successful in history, returning 25% annually for nearly 2 decades. He was known for training brilliant young analysts and then backing them with his own money to start their own funds. The industry called them the Tiger Cubs. Robertson saw something in Hwang. He brought him to Tiger Management in 1996. Within a few years, Hwang had established himself as the firm's Asia expert. Robertson would later call him the Michael Jordan of Asian investing. The nickname wasn't hyperbole. In 1999, during the depths of the Asian financial crisis, Hwang convinced Robertson to take a 6.5% stake in SK Telecom, a Korean wireless carrier trading at distressed prices. Within months, Tiger had made $1 billion on the trade, more than doubling their money through aggressive shareholder activism. When Robertson shut down Tiger Management in 2000, worn out by the dot-com bubble and investor redemptions, he gave Hwang a parting gift, $25 million in seed capital to start his own fund. In January 2001, Hwang launched Tiger Asia Management. The early years were spectacular. Tiger Asia finished 2001 up 70%, mostly on the strength of Korean stocks. By 2002, with $140 million in assets, Hwang closed the fund to new investors. By 2007, he was managing $8 billion and delivering annualized returns of 40%. He was quiet, methodical, intensely focused. Colleagues said he kept his desk completely clear to help concentrate his mind. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He hosted morning Bible studies at the office. Then, everything fell apart. In late 2008, Hwang made an enormous bet against Volkswagen. Strange for a fund supposedly focused on Asian stocks. He was far from alone. Many hedge funds were shorting VW. But when Porsche suddenly announced it was raising its stake, the stock exploded. Volkswagen rose 348% in 48 hours. It was one of the most violent short squeezes in history. Tiger Asia ended 2008 down 23%. Investors were furious. Many pulled their money, angry that an Asia-focused fund had gotten crushed on a German automaker. But the real blow came from regulators. In December 2008 and January 2009, Tiger Asia had participated in private placements for shares of Bank of China and China Construction Bank. The placements came with conditions. The banks shared confidential information about the offerings, and Tiger Asia signed wall-crossing agreements, promising not to trade on that information until the deals closed. Tiger Asia broke those agreements immediately. On Hwang's orders, head trader Raymond Park shorted the stocks before the placements were announced, then covered those shorts with the discounted placement shares. It was textbook insider trading, and it made Tiger Asia $16 million. But that wasn't all. Between November 2008 and February 2009, Hwang directed Park to place deliberately losing trades at month-end to push down stock prices. Because Tiger Asia held short positions in those stocks, depressing prices increased the value of those shorts, which inflated assets under management and boosted Hwang's fees by about $500,000. Hong Kong regulators caught on first. The SEC followed. By 2012, Hwang was negotiating settlements on 2 continents. The final tally, $44 million to the SEC, $16 million in criminal penalties, $5.8 million to Hong Kong investors. Tiger Asia pleaded guilty to wire fraud. Hwang was banned from Hong Kong trading for 4 years and prohibited by the SEC from associating with brokers, dealers, or investment advisors. He was effectively banned from managing other people's money. For most people, this would have been the end. A career-destroying scandal, a permanent mark. But Hwang had a plan. In 2010, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act, a sweeping financial reform bill designed to prevent another crisis like 2008. Among its provisions was a requirement that hedge funds register with the SEC and submit detailed reports about their holdings. But there was an exception. Family offices, firms that manage money solely for one family, were exempted. The rationale was simple. The Investment Advisors Act wasn't designed to regulate interactions between family members. Registration would unnecessarily intrude on the privacy of the family involved. It was a reasonable carve-out. A wealthy family managing its own money shouldn't face the same regulatory burden as a hedge fund managing billions for outside investors. But for Bill Hwang, it was something else entirely. In 2013, the same year his SEC ban took effect, Hwang founded a new firm. He called it Archegos Capital Management. The name was Greek, Archegos meaning leader or prince. In the New Testament, it's used to describe Christ as the author of salvation and the Prince of Life. Structurally, Archegos was a family office. It managed only Hwang's personal wealth, plus money from family members and key employees. There were no outside investors. And because it was a family office, Archegos would never file a single form with the SEC. Not 113F. Not 113D. Nothing. A convicted insider trader had found the perfect blind spot. The starting capital was modest, about $200 million, the remains of Hwang's Tiger Asia fortune. But Hwang had learned something from his earlier career. Leverage was everything. He turned to a financial instrument called a total return swap. Here's how it works. Instead of buying stock directly, Archegos would enter into a contract with a bank. The bank would buy the actual shares. Archegos would pay a fee and in return receive all the gains or losses on those shares, without ever owning them. It sounds complicated, but the benefits were straightforward. First, leverage. Under normal rules, buying stock on margin requires putting up 50% of the purchase price. But swaps had no such requirement. Archegos could get exposure to $100 of stock with as little as $10 or $15 in collateral, sometimes less. Second, secrecy. When you own more than 5% of a company's stock, you're required to file public disclosures. But Archegos never owned the stocks. The banks did. There was nothing to report. Hwang could quietly accumulate massive positions without anyone knowing. Third, diversification, or rather, the appearance of it. Archegos used multiple banks, Credit Suisse, Nomura, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, UBS, Deutsche Bank, and others. Each bank knew about its own positions with Archegos. None knew about the others. This created a dangerous illusion. To any individual bank, Archegos looked like a reasonably diversified client. In reality, Hwang was using all of them to build concentrated bets on the same handful of stocks. By 2020, Archegos had grown from $200 million to $10 billion. Hwang's annualized returns were extraordinary, well over 30%. He was executing the same playbook that had worked at Tiger Asia: find undervalued stocks, build enormous positions, and ride them up. But now, with swaps instead of direct ownership, he could do it on a scale that was previously unimaginable. And then came the pandemic. The market crash of March 2020 was brutal but brief. Central banks flooded the system with liquidity. Interest rates collapsed. Stock prices recovered within months and then kept climbing. For Hwang, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. With borrowing costs near zero and banks hungry for business, Archegos began to accelerate. Between March 2020 and March 2021, the firm's capital exploded from $1.5 billion to $36 billion. Its total market exposure, the value of all its swap positions, reached $160 billion. At his peak, Hwang controlled more than 50% of ViacomCBS's freely trading shares, more than 60% of Discovery, more than 70% of GSX Techchedu, a Chinese education company. No one outside Archegos knew. The companies didn't know. Their other investors didn't know. The banks knew only their individual pieces, and Hwang's team was lying to them about the rest. Banks are not stupid. When they extend billions in credit to a single client, they ask questions. What's your total exposure? How concentrated are your positions? What's your liquidity if you need to meet a margin call? Archegos had answers. They were lies. William Tomita was Archegos' head trader. He had been with Hwang since the Tiger Asia days. At the criminal trial, he testified as a cooperating witness, having pleaded guilty to his own role in the scheme. His testimony painted a picture of systematic deception. When banks asked about concentration, Archegos told them the portfolio was diversified. When banks asked about Archegos' largest position, the team claimed it was never more than 15% of the portfolio. In reality, single positions sometimes exceeded 35%. When banks asked about cross-exposure, whether Archegos held similar positions with other prime brokers, Hwang's team denied it. Scott Becker, the chief risk officer, repeatedly assured counterparties that positions were unique to them. They weren't. When banks asked about liquidity, Archegos claimed it could meet margin calls quickly. In truth, Hwang had invested so heavily in illiquid stocks that any forced sale would crater the prices. The SEC complaint was blunt. Archegos repeatedly and deliberately misled many of Archegos' counterparties about Archegos' exposure, concentration, and liquidity in order to get increased trading capacity. But the fraud wasn't just about lying to banks. It was also about manipulating the market itself. According to prosecutors, Hwang directed traders to prop up his stocks through carefully timed buying. The strategies had names. A firm trade meant buying at a specific price and never letting the stock fall below it. Let's step it up meant aggressive purchasing to push prices higher. Archegos concentrated its trading at strategically important moments, at the market open, to set the tone, during the day to bid up prices, and especially in the final 30 minutes before close, when low liquidity meant maximum impact. One example from trial testimony: in October 2020, the Chinese education company GSX Techchedu was being targeted by short sellers. Muddy Waters, a prominent research firm, had published a scathing report calling the company a fraud. Hwang disagreed. More importantly, he was long. What followed was what prosecutors called a Herculean defense. Archegos burned through cash, liquidated positions in other stocks, including Amazon, and plowed everything into GSX to keep the price up. On a single day, the fund lost $749 million defending the position. But they held the line, and the playbook became a template for daily manipulation across Archegos' entire portfolio. Another example from December 2020. Tomita messaged his team that someone had hit Farfetch down 50 cents. Within 59 seconds of the market close, Archegos placed a $175 million order to push the stock to its target price of $62. Archegos represented 70% of the trading volume in the final minute. Afterward, Tomita reported to Hwang that the last-minute trade had generated $46 million in paper gains. These weren't investment decisions, they were manipulation. And the gains weren't real, they existed only on paper, sustained by the constant injection of borrowed money. As one prosecutor put it, Archegos was a $36 billion house of cards. At the sentencing hearing, Assistant U.S. Attorney Andrew Mark Thomas made an observation that cut to the heart of the scheme. An email had surfaced from March 2021, during the final days before the collapse. Andy Mills, an Archegos executive and former president of a Christian college, had written to a colleague with a simple request. "Pray that the markets rise tomorrow." Thomas paused. "The point at which your business plan requires divine intervention," he said, "is the point at which you have a solvency problem." By March 2021, ViacomCBS had become the centerpiece of Hwang's empire. The media company, owner of CBS, Paramount Pictures, and the streaming service now known as Paramount Plus, had seen its stock rise more than 700% from its pandemic low. Part of that was genuine enthusiasm about streaming. Part of it was Hwang, buying relentlessly through his swap positions, driving the price ever higher. On Monday, March 22nd, ViacomCBS announced it would sell $3 billion in new stock to raise capital for its streaming ambitions. Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan were the lead underwriters. For a healthy company with a rising stock price, this should have been routine. Instead, it triggered the unraveling. The problem was supply. Archegos controlled so much of ViacomCBS's float that any dilution would be catastrophic. The stock dropped nearly 7% on the announcement. On Wednesday, March 24th, the offering priced at $85 per share, well below recent trading levels. Retail investors bought in, expecting a bargain. They had no idea what was coming. The same day, Tencent Music, another Archegos holding, dropped 20%. Hwang's positions were correlated. When one fell, his total portfolio suffered, which reduced his collateral, which put pressure on everything else. At Credit Suisse, risk managers watched nervously. They had extended billions to Archegos. The firm's excess margin, the cushion above minimum requirements, had been more than $600 million at the start of the week. By Wednesday evening, it was gone. Credit Suisse called for $175 million in additional collateral. Archegos paid. On Thursday, March 25th, ViacomCBS dropped another 23%. Credit Suisse calculated that it would need to call $2.7 billion from Archegos. That evening, the banks held a conference call. Representatives from Credit Suisse, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and others dialed in. So did Hwang and his team. The banks urged Hwang to liquidate, wind down the positions in an orderly fashion, spread the selling over several days to minimize market impact. Hwang refused. He expressed optimism about quickly unwinding positions, but wouldn't commit to selling. What happened next was a bank run in slow motion, except the banks were running from each other. After the call, Morgan Stanley made a decision. Without telling the other banks, it began quietly selling Archegos positions to hedge funds at a discount. By Thursday night, Morgan Stanley had moved $5 billion. Goldman Sachs had the same idea. Before the market opened on Friday morning, Goldman began dumping blocks of stock. First, $6.6 billion in Baidu, Tencent Music, and VipShop. Then, $3.9 billion in ViacomCBS, Discovery, and others. By the end of Friday, Goldman had liquidated more than $10 billion. Credit Suisse and Nomura were slower. They had hoped for a coordinated solution, an orderly unwind that would minimize losses for everyone. By the time they realized coordination had failed, it was too late. The stocks were in freefall. ViacomCBS, which had traded above $100 just weeks earlier, collapsed to 48. Discovery dropped by similar amounts. GSX Tech Eju, Baidu, iQIYI, everything Hwang had touched was cratering. Archegos couldn't meet the margin calls. It defaulted. By the end of the week, more than $100 billion in market value had evaporated. The banks that had enabled Hwang's leverage were now counting their losses. Credit Suisse, $5.5 billion. Nomura, $2.85 billion. Morgan Stanley, $911 million. UBS, $861 million. MUFG, $270 million. Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank, minimal, thanks to their speed. For Goldman, which had moved first and fastest, the lesson was clear. In a crisis, there was no prize for cooperation. For Credit Suisse, the Archegos loss was existential. Combined with the simultaneous collapse of Greensill Capital, another client disaster, the bank never recovered. It would be acquired by UBS 2 years later, a 167-year-old institution, undone in part by the bets of a single family office. U.S. Attorney Damian Williams summarized it simply: the music stopped, the bubble burst, the prices dropped, and when they did, billions of dollars of capital evaporated nearly overnight. The banks made for easy villains. Credit Suisse had extended billions in credit to a convicted insider trader. Its risk managers had flagged concerns as early as September 2020 and been ignored. An internal review would later conclude that the bank had enabled Archegos' voracious risk-taking while maintaining a lackadaisical attitude toward risk. But the banks were not the only victims. On March 24, 2021, the same day ViacomCBS priced its stock offering, ordinary investors bought shares at $85. Many were retail traders attracted by the company's streaming ambitions. Some were pension funds and retirement accounts. 2 days later, those shares were worth $48, a loss of 43% in 48 hours. The prospectus for the offering, dated March 23rd, had made no mention of Archegos, no mention of the concentrated positions, no mention of the banks that were simultaneously preparing to dump billions of dollars of the same stock. Some of those banks, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, were underwriters on the offering. They were selling new ViacomCBS shares to the public while also holding massive swap positions with Archegos that they knew were about to unwind. Whether this constituted a conflict of interest would become the subject of lawsuits. In 2024, a class action settlement was reached for $120 million, the largest Section 11 settlement in a state court case to that point. The lead plaintiffs included the Municipal Police Employees Retirement System of Baton Rouge, but $120 million was a fraction of the losses. Prosecutors estimated that more than $100 billion in market value disappeared from the stocks Hwang had manipulated. The settlement represented barely 0.1%. Then there were Archegos' own employees. Like many financial firms, Archegos required employees to invest alongside the founder. At minimum, 25% of annual bonuses had to be deferred into a company investment plan. The plan was marketed as a chance to share in the firm's success. In practice, it was a trap. Employees had to declare how much they would defer before they knew what their bonus would be. The message, according to a later lawsuit, was crystal clear: no contribution, no bonus. The Deferred Compensation Fund held about $500 million in employee money by early 2021. When Archegos collapsed, that money was gone. Brendan Sullivan, a former managing director, filed suit in July 2022. He claimed he was owed $50 million. He described Archegos as a personality cult, where loyalty to Hwang, not performance, was paramount. According to Sullivan, employees who declared gratitude for God, Hwang, and Archegos at company retreats received high praise and manufactured applause. Those who questioned policies or offered honest assessments received personal abuse, lower compensation, and adverse professional treatment. Sullivan also alleged that Hwang had told employees the foundation was his fallback plan. If anything happened to Archegos, he said, loyal employees and good followers could join him there. After the collapse, that's exactly what happened. Several top Archegos executives were hired by the Grace and Mercy Foundation, the same foundation that would later supply 500 pages of character witnesses for Hwang's sentencing. The prosecution noticed. People who might testify against him, Judge Hellerstein observed, completing the prosecutor's thought about who had been hired. At sentencing, the court faced a question: who should receive restitution first? The government had recommended paying the banks, Credit Suisse, Nomura, and others, before anyone else. The banks had lost $10 billion. They had extensive documentation. They were easy to compensate. But advocates argued that ordinary investors should come first. They had bought manipulated stocks at artificial prices. They had no idea what was happening, They were, in every meaningful sense, victims of fraud. In December 2024, the court agreed. Individual investors would be prioritized ahead of the banks. 5 Archegos employees were awarded $10 million, with priority over the bank claims. More employees were seeking to join. Judge Hellerstein explained his reasoning simply. The employees' losses were more direct. But collecting would be another matter. Hwang's remaining net worth was $55 million. The restitution order was $9.4 billion. The banks would likely never see a dollar. Throughout the trial, Bill Hwang was seen reading a Bible devotional. He took notes in the margins. His supporters prayed openly in the courtroom. The faith was genuine, at least it appeared to be. Hwang had grown up the son of a pastor. He hosted Friday morning Bible studies at the office. He funded lunchtime scripture readings through his foundation. He served on the board of Fuller Theological Seminary, one of the largest evangelical institutions in the country. At the Grace and Mercy Foundation's office, visitors encountered a striking piece of art. Red paint and manipulated mesh hung over a gray New York City skyline. Hwang told people it came to him in a dream, a vision of the blood of Christ washing over the city, cleansing the great metropolis of its sins. Bloomberg described him as like a modern Medici, commissioning a famous artist to bring his dream to life. He also talked constantly about the intersection of faith and finance. "I try to invest according to the Word of God and the power of the Holy Spirit," he once said. "I'm like a little child thinking, what can I do today? Where can I invest to please our God?" When we create good companies through the capitalism that God has allowed, it enhances people's lives. God delights in those things. His charitable giving was extraordinary. The Grace and Mercy Foundation, which Hwang co-founded with his wife Becky in 2006, had distributed nearly $80 million in grants to Christian organizations by 2018. Recipients included Fuller Seminary, the Museum of the Bible, International Justice Mission, Prison Fellowship, Young Life, The Navigators, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, Cru, Youth for Christ, Focus on the Family, and hundreds of others. Warren Cole Smith, who monitors Christian ministries' finances at Ministry Watch, said he could not think of another foundation or individual that has given significant donations to as many Christian organizations. Hwang was celebrated in evangelical circles. He spoke at conferences. He appeared in promotional videos. He was held up as proof that faith and finance could coexist, that a devout Christian could succeed on Wall Street without compromising his values. What many of those organizations didn't know was that Hwang had pleaded guilty to wire fraud in 2012. The settlement had banned him from managing other people's money. He had structured Archegos specifically to circumvent that ban. The faith, it turned out, coexisted quite comfortably with fraud. At Archegos, the religious culture extended to employees. According to the Sullivan lawsuit, job interviews revolved around religion and an investigation into the candidate's religious upbringing. At mandatory company retreats, employees were expected to publicly declare their gratitude for God, Hwang, and Archegos. Those who didn't were marked. Those who offered honest assessments or questioned actions or policies received personal abuse, lower compensation, and adverse professional treatment, the lawsuit alleged. The micromanagement was intense. William Tomita, the head trader, testified that Hwang watched employees via Zoom throughout the day, staring at a P&L spreadsheet. Sometimes he didn't even need to vocalize, Tomita said. On the Zoom, he would just glare, and that glance alone meant we were about to get yelled at. On one occasion, a trader stepped away to use the bathroom when a stock moved. Bill yelled at us, Tomita testified. He raised his voice, and he yelled at us that we can't just go to the bathroom. The same man who hosted Bible studies was screaming at employees for taking bathroom breaks. Tomita also testified about the lies. Throughout my training, he said, I had been taught by Bill when necessary to give misleading pictures about the fund and its positions. The misleading pictures were told to banks. They were told to counterparties. They were the foundation of a $36 billion fraud. At sentencing, the defense presented Hwang as a humble man. He drove a Hyundai. He shopped at outlet malls. His only hobbies were faith, food, philanthropy, and books. The prosecution presented a different picture. A man who rented a Hudson Yards apartment during his trial, who hired potential witnesses at his foundation, who apologized without admitting guilt. Judge Hellerstein struggled with the contradiction. "Why do good people do bad things?" he asked. He never got an answer. On April 27, 2022, Bill Hwang was arrested at his home in Tenafly, New Jersey. He was charged with 11 counts: racketeering conspiracy, securities fraud, wire fraud, and market manipulation. Patrick Halligan, Archegos' chief financial officer, was arrested the same morning. He faced 3 counts. 2 other executives, head trader William Tomita and chief risk officer Scott Becker, had already pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate. They would testify against their former boss. Julian Robertson, now 88 years old, was asked about his protégé's collapse. His loyalty was immediate and unwavering. "I'm just very sad about it," Robertson said. "I'm a great fan of Bill, and it could probably happen to anyone, but I'm sorry it happened to Bill." He called it a business mistake and said he would invest with Hwang again. "Because he's a good investor, and he'll learn from this. We're always learning." Robertson would die in August 2022 at 90 years old. He never saw the conviction or the 18-year sentence. Hwang was released on a $100 million bond, secured by 2 properties and $5 million in cash. He said he had lost his passport. His lawyers called the charges baseless. "Bill Hwang is entirely innocent of any wrongdoing," they said. "There is no evidence whatsoever that he committed any kind of crime." The trial began in May 2024. It lasted 7 weeks. The prosecution presented a case built on documents, recordings, and cooperating witnesses. They showed how Hwang had used swap contracts to build secret positions in a handful of stocks, how he had lied to banks about his concentration, his liquidity, his cross-exposure, how he had directed traders to manipulate prices through carefully timed buying. By 2021, prosecutor Andrew Thomas told the jury, the defendant's lies and manipulation had ensnared nearly a dozen stocks and half of Wall Street in a $100 billion fraud. A fraud that came crashing down in a matter of days. The defense countered that Hwang was an aggressive trader, not a criminal. They called the case the most aggressive open market manipulation case ever brought. They argued that prosecutors had criminalized aggressive but legal trading methods. They noted that Hwang had never sold his positions. This couldn't have been a pump and dump scheme, they said, because there was no dump. Hwang believed in the stocks. He just happened to be wrong. On July 10, 2024, after a day and a half of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on 10 of 11 counts. Hwang was acquitted on 1 charge, market manipulation of the Chinese video company IQWE. On everything else, he was convicted. Halligan was found guilty on all 3 counts. 4 months later, Hwang stood before Judge Hellerstein for sentencing. The prosecution asked for 21 years. The defense asked for home confinement. The judge gave him 18 years plus 3 years of supervised release. "The amount of losses caused by your conduct," Hellerstein said, "are larger than any other losses I have dealt with." He ordered restitution of $9.4 billion. He gave priority to employees over banks. He scheduled Hwang to surrender to begin his sentence. Hwang remains free pending appeal. William Tomita, the head trader who executed Hwang's orders and then became the government's star witness, received no prison time. A judge credited his exceptional cooperation and noted that he had publicly broken with the culture of Archegos that demanded unyielding respect for Mr. Hwang. In 2025, Tomita bought an art gallery in South Florida with a former Tiger Asia colleague. The man who executed the manipulation got probation. The man who ordered it got 18 years. His fortune, once estimated at $20 to $30 billion, has been reduced to $55 million. His charitable foundation, which gave $600 million to Christian ministries, faces an uncertain future. Credit Suisse no longer exists. It was absorbed by UBS in March 2023, the Archegos losses having accelerated its demise. The regulatory loophole that allowed Archegos to operate in secrecy remains largely intact. Family offices are still exempt from most SEC disclosure requirements. Total return swaps still allow investors to build massive positions without public reporting. After the collapse, there were calls for reform. The SEC proposed new rules. Congress held hearings. Advocates demanded that family offices face the same scrutiny as hedge funds. Most of those proposals went nowhere. As of this writing, there are more than 10,000 family offices in the United States, managing an estimated $6 trillion. Any one of them could be building the next Archegos. No one would know until it was too late. The prosecutor called the case a national calamity. The judge called it unprecedented. But in the end, the system that created Bill Hwang remained largely unchanged. In January 2026, while still free on bail, Hwang applied for a presidential pardon. The music stopped once. It will start again.